non-violent way to achieve political change, to right a political injustice, then violence becomes justifiable. Marx thinks. And so violence is necessary, Marx thinks, to birth the revolution. The aim of prior politics was to eradicate violence, but for Marx, as history continues to progress and society to improve, violence is a necessary part of that progress. Now, we hear today, right, violence is the worst possible thing that you can do as a political actor. There's no place for political violence. We revere Martin Luther King and Gandhi as nonviolent protesters, right? We should never forget that part of the effectiveness of Martin Luther King's nonviolent approach was that right beside him in the background there was Malcolm X, who was invoking the possibility of violence. Violence was part of the equation, and Martin Luther King's nonviolent tactics were understood and embraced, and you might say were effective, in part because they happened in a landscape where violence was very much also a possibility. So what Arendt wants to point out is that these people who would say that violence is unjustified in any circumstances, that in fact, violence is always at the heart of state power. And so it's never possible to eradicate violence from politics. Violence is always inherent to politics, always a possibility within politics, and always an actuality within politics. And we can think, I think, again of Nietzsche and the idea that, why do I abide by social norms? Why do I have guilt and a conscience? Why do I accept the idea of good and true? It's because of this original violence, the punishment that the powerful exact on the oppressed, which teaches them, domesticates them to accept these ideas of good, right? So the law, for example, is only law and has power only because it's backed up by violence in some sense, right? Now, the way that violence is manifested changes. Right? As we saw, it used to be very cruel corporeal violence. The violence of going to prison is a very different kind of violence, but a violence nevertheless. In the United States, we still practice the death penalty in many states. And in general, right, the police have the right to use lethal force, to use violent means when necessary. In other words, the law is always authorized through violence. Violence is always already part of the state. So Arendt writes on page 23 to Marx, on the contrary, in opposition to those who would condemn forms of any form of violence, and anyone who would consider violence as a viable political option. To Marx, on the contrary, violence, or rather the possession of the means of violence, is the constituent element of all forms of government. The state is the instrument of the ruling class by means of which it oppresses and exploits, and the whole sphere of political action is characterized by the use of violence. The whole sphere of political action is characterized by the use of violence, right? That which can and cannot be done, that which is legal and illegal, the laws which create the form of the state, all of that is underwritten, authorized, and backed up with the promise of violence. And anyone then who says that violence has no place in politics is fundamentally misunderstanding how politics works, or is lying, is using rhetoric to maintain the violence of the state and to quash any violence that would come up to meet and do battle against the violence of the state. To overthrow an oppressive state, violence is needed. Even the nonviolent protests of the 60s had violence in the background. Okay, these are my notes, but I already went over this. Right? Nevertheless, right, Arendt thinks Marx sometimes goes too far. She writes, Marx's glorification of violence therefore contains the more specific denial of logos, of speech, the diametrically opposite and traditionally most human form of intercourse. So again, Marx thinks that he can overcome the tradition of politics, Western politics, through reversal, by saying it is not persuasion, it's not discourse, dialectic that changes politics, it is violence. Right? It is corporeal, it is imminent, it is this worldly. Forget speech, forget logos, forget political dialectic, right? Only violence achieves the overthrow of oppressive states. And Arendt wants to say, violence has its place. Violence is sometimes justified, where speech cannot be used. Violence can be a potential political tool. However, for Arendt, while violence has the power to transform political existence, violence in itself is not political. And Marx's rejection through this reversal of physical violence and speech, his rejection of speech closes off important possibilities for politics and state and existence after the end of the Western political tradition. For Arendt, we can't simply reverse things. Reversing things cancels everything out. We have to hold on to this idea that politics fundamentally is about discourse, is about speech, is about persuasion, is about argument, is about intellectual debate. We can never exclude that from the state. The idea of permanent revolution I don't. I'm going to leave that thought unfinished. But for Arendt, interprets Marx as rejecting, right, this denial of logos, the denial of speech as as politically powerful. Arendt wants to reject this. Right? We have to maintain this. We can't simply reverse hierarchies. We have to come up with new forms of politics, new ways of thinking about politics. Take a little bit from each side, perhaps. We have to retain this idea of speech. Finally, Marx, very much in opposition to Nietzsche, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, is populist and non-elitist. Right? Nietzsche is an elitist. Right? He believes in a distinction between the many and the few. And Marx is a populist who believes in that the universal equality of all people is a valuable thing, is a value. He values that in a way that Nietzsche certainly does not. So he thought there were some with exceptional power of self-affirmation. Nietzsche thought there were some with exceptional power of self-affirmation who would remake philosophy anew again and again. Marx thought philosophy could be simplified and mastered by everyone, that it's not about individual ideas, but universal ideas of justice based in material circumstances. So I'm going to pause here and come back in just a minute and finish up with Arendt.